My name is Celeste Adeyemi. I'm 34 years old. And the Sunday afternoon, my brother sat down at my parents' kitchen table and told them I had been stealing from the family business was the day I finally understood that some people will hand you a verdict before they've bothered to run a trial. He said it the way you'd report a weather update. Flat. Practiced. He set a manila folder on the table, put his hand on top of it, and said, "She's been taking from the accounts. I have records." My father set down his glass. He said, "I always knew something was off." My mother did not look at me. I picked up my bag from the back of my chair, settled the strap on my shoulder, and said, "I hope the records are thorough." Then I walked out of the house, got into my car, and sat in my parents' driveway for 45 seconds before I started the engine. What none of them knew, what I had not told anyone in that house, was that a certified forensic audit of the family business had been underway for 11 days, commissioned not by me but by the business's outside accounting firm, Hargrove and Lind, at the recommendation of their senior partner, a precise and unhurried woman named Dorothy Achebe. The audit was scheduled for completion in 3 days. The report would be delivered in 14. I drove home. I did not call anyone. I want to tell you about the business first because you cannot understand what happened in that kitchen without understanding what Adeyemi Home Services was and what it had cost each of us to keep it running. My parents, Funmi and Deo Adeyemi, started the business in 1999, the year I was 5 and my brother Khalad was 9. It was a residential cleaning and property maintenance company, the kind of operation that begins as 2 people and a van, and if the owners are disciplined and the work is consistent, becomes something more substantial over time. By the time I was in high school, Adeyemi Home Services had 12 contracted employees, a fleet of 3 vehicles, and a client list of 140 residential accounts in the Raleigh-Durham area. My parents had built it by working hours that I, as a child, simply accepted as normal. My father leaving before 6 in the morning, my mother doing the invoicing at the kitchen table after dinner because the billing software they used required a desktop computer and the desktop was in the kitchen. I grew up inside that business the way some children grow up inside a church or a restaurant. It was the architecture of our household, and everything else was arranged around it. I knew what a client retention rate was by the time I was 12. I knew the difference between a net 30 and net 60 payment term before I knew how to drive. Khalad, for years older than me, had a different relationship to the work. He was capable, he could run a crew, he could estimate a job, he could manage a difficult client with the particular combination of warmth and firmness that our father had, and that I have always had to work harder to produce. What Khalad was less good at was the accounting side. Numbers bored him the way physical work bored me. Not because either of us lacked the ability, but because temperament is real and the business had, over time, sorted us accordingly. I went to NC State for accounting. I came back with a degree and a clear understanding of what the business's books actually looked like, which was functional but disorganized in ways that had been accumulating for years. My parents' original bookkeeper had retired in 2015, and the replacement system they'd set up was a combination of QuickBooks entries and a spreadsheet my mother maintained manually that the two did not always reconcile. There were vendor accounts that hadn't been audited in 3 years. There was a payroll tax filing from 2017 that had an error no one had caught. There was a receivables column that contained 3 accounts so old they had moved past the point of being collectible without a collections action, but no one had written them off because writing them off felt, to my father, like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. I spent my first 18 months back in the business doing nothing but cleaning the books. No new clients, no expanded services, no growth initiatives, just reconciliation, correction, and documentation. I hired an outside CPA, a methodical man named Gerald Fosu at a firm called Triangle Financial Group, to review my work quarterly and sign off on the corrected filings. The 2017 payroll error cost us $4,230 in back taxes and a modest penalty. My father paid it without complaint, which told me he had already known something was off and had been waiting for someone to name it. By the time I was 30, I had the books in a state that Gerald Fosa described, at our 3rd quarterly review, as the cleanest set of small business records I've seen from a family operation this size. I put that note in a file. Khalad ran the field operations. I ran the financial and administrative side. This division was not formally established. We had never sat down and written it out, but it had the solidity of a thing that has been true long enough to become assumed. Our parents had moved into a reduced operational role as their energy for the physical work decreased. My father still came to the office every day, but the office was now a proper space. We'd moved from the kitchen table to a small commercial suite in a business park off Interstate 40, and his role was primarily client relationship management, which suited him. The arrangement worked. The business grew. In the fiscal year before the Sunday lunch in question, Adeyemi Home Services had grossed $1,340,000 in service revenue, a number I had reported to my parents at our annual family review meeting in March, and that had made my mother put her hand over her mouth for a moment before she composed herself. What had been changing in the year before that Sunday, changing quietly, in ways I had noticed and documented but had not yet acted on, was the accounts payable structure. Claude handled vendor relationships in the field, supply orders, equipment maintenance, fuel accounts. In the previous 14 months, 3 vendor accounts had shown payment patterns I couldn't reconcile against the corresponding service records. A cleaning supply vendor called Piedmont Commercial Supply had been invoiced and paid $68,400 over 12 months, a figure that was 31% higher than the prior year's spend with the same vendor, without a corresponding increase in client volume or service scope that would explain it. A maintenance equipment account at a company called Durham Tool and Fleet had $22,750 in charges that I could not match to specific job records. And a fuel account, straightforward, simple, the kind of account that should produce the cleanest paper trail of anything in a service business, had $9,180 in charges across a 6-month period that did not correspond to the vehicle mileage logs. I built a reconciliation document. I dated every entry. I noted every gap between the charge and the corresponding job record. And then, instead of bringing it to Claude directly, which was what I would have done in a different family with a different history, I called Dorothy Achebe at Hargrove and Lind. I had met Dorothy Achebe 2 years earlier, when I brought Hargrove and Lind on as the business's outside auditing firm, replacing a smaller practice that had retired. Dorothy was the kind of accountant who made other accountants slightly uncomfortable, because she was faster and more thorough than most of them, and she did not soften her findings to manage relationships. I trusted her precisely because of that. I explained what I had found. I gave her the reconciliation document. I asked her what she recommended. She said, "I recommend a forensic review of the 3 accounts, going back 24 months. I can have a team on it by end of week." I said, "How long will it take?" She said, 14 days. Maybe 12 if the records are as clean as you've kept them. I said, "Start Friday." That conversation happened on a Wednesday. The audit began on a Friday. On the following Sunday, 11 days into the audit, I drove to my parents' house for the standing Sunday lunch that had been a fixture of our family's week for as long as I could remember, sat down at the kitchen table where I had watched my mother do invoicing as a child, and listened to my brother tell my parents I was a thief. I want to be precise about what happened in the room in the seconds after I left, because my mother told me about it later, in a conversation I will get to. My father picked up the folder Claude had set on the table and opened it. Inside were printed bank statements, not the business's statements, but personal account statements, with certain figures highlighted in yellow. Claude had annotated them in the margins. My father looked at the first page for approximately 30 seconds. My mother said, "What did you do?" She said it to Claude. Claude said, "I'm showing you what she's been doing." My mother said, "Did you talk to her first?" Claude said, "I'm talking to you first. You're the owners." My father said, "These are her accounts?" Claude said, "These are transfers that came from the business account." My mother looked at the page. She said, "How much?" Claude said, "Over 18 months, close to $40,000. My father set the folder down. He looked at the wall for a moment. My mother, according to her own account, looked at the kitchen table where she had done invoicing for 20 years and thought about what that number meant. What neither of them thought to do in that moment was call me. I found out about the folder's contents when my mother called me the following Wednesday. I had spent Sunday evening, Monday, and Tuesday working normally, at the office, on the books, corresponding with Dorothy Achebe's team, which was now 3 days from completing the review. I had not called my parents. I had not called Claude. My mother's Wednesday call lasted 11 minutes. She told me what was in the folder. She told me what Claude had said. She said, with a specific cadence she used when she was delivering something she wished she didn't have to deliver, "Your father thinks we need to address this as a family." I said, "I know about the discrepancies, Mom." She was quiet. I said, "I commissioned a forensic audit 11 days ago. Dorothy Achabe at Hargrove and Lind is running it. It will be complete in approximately 3 days. I'll share the report with you and Dad the day it arrives." My mother said, "You already knew." I said, "I found irregularities in 3 vendor accounts in September. I documented them and engaged Dorothy rather than acting on incomplete information. That's what you do when you find something that needs verification." My mother said, "Claude said." I said, "Mom, I know what Claude said. I'm telling you what the audit will say. Those are 2 different documents." She was quiet again. Then she said, "He showed your father bank statements." I said, "I know. When the report arrives, I'll explain what those statements actually show. It will be easier to do that with the audit in hand than to try to explain it now." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You should have told us." I said, "I didn't want to tell you anything until I was certain. I'm going to be certain in 3 days." I heard her exhale. Not a sob, just the exhale of a woman who had been holding a breath for 4 days and had found one half of a reason to release it. I said, "I'll call you when it arrives." The report arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by secure courier to the office suite. Dorothy Achabe called me 20 minutes before it arrived to tell me it was coming and to give me a summary of the findings, so I would not be reading them cold. She said, "The 3 vendor accounts you flagged show a consistent pattern of invoice inflation and personal diversion. Piedmont Commercial Supply, $41,200 in fraudulent invoices over 16 months, with corresponding payments to a personal account registered to Claude Adiemi. Durham Tool and Fleet, $19,330 in charges that don't correspond to legitimate business purchases, same diversion pattern. The fuel account is more complex. Some of those charges are legitimate, some aren't, but the net fraudulent amount is approximately $6,890. Total confirmed fraudulent diversion, $67,420 over 16 months. I wrote down the number. I said, "And the statements Claude showed my parents?" She said, "I reviewed those in context. They appear to be business account statements with selected transactions highlighted in a way that, without context, could suggest irregular outflows. 2 of the highlighted transactions are your salary draws, which are properly documented and authorized. 1 is a vendor payment to Triangle Financial Group, your outside CPA. The presentation was misleading." I said, "Thank you, Dorothy." She said, "The report is thorough. Every finding is supported by primary documentation." I said, "I expected nothing less." I sat at my desk for approximately 10 minutes after that call. It was late afternoon, and the administrative staff had left. Through the window, I could see the parking lot, and beyond it, the tree line along the edge of the business park. I had been coming to this building for 4 years. I had chosen it, signed the lease, set up the filing systems, selected the furniture. There was a framed photo on my desk of my parents in front of the original van, the first vehicle, the one they'd bought before I was born, that my mother had given me when I moved into this office. I picked up my phone and called my parents' house. My mother answered. I said, "The report arrived. Can you and Dad come to the office tomorrow morning? I'd like to show it to you in person." She said yes. I said, "Ask Claude to come too." There was a pause. She said, "All right." The Friday morning meeting in the office suite was not a confrontation in the way that word usually implies. There was no raised voice. There was no dramatic entrance. My parents arrived first at 9 and sat in the 2 chairs across from my desk. My mother's hands were folded in her lap. My father had his reading glasses in his breast pocket, which he put on when I handed him the cover page of the report. Claude arrived 12 minutes later. He saw the report on the desk and his jaw moved slightly, a small, compressed adjustment. He sat in the chair I'd placed against the wall to the side. I said, I'm going to walk through the findings. This will take about 20 minutes. I'd ask everyone to read before asking questions. I handed each of them a copy. I had made 3 copies, spiral-bound, with a cover sheet that said, Forensic Review, Adeyemi Home Services Vendor Accounts, Hargrove and Lind, prepared by Dorothy Achebe, CPA, CFE. CFE is Certified Fraud Examiner. I had chosen Dorothy Achebe 2 years ago in part because of that credential. I had not known at the time that I would need it. My father turned pages steadily. He was a slow and careful reader, which was a quality I had always respected in him and which served him well in that moment. My mother turned pages more quickly, stopped, went back, turned forward again. Khalad did not open his copy for approximately 4 minutes. Then he opened it to a page near the middle. I let them read. When my father finished, he set the report on his knee and looked at his hands. He did not speak for a moment. Then he looked at Khalad. He said, Is this accurate? Khalad said, The auditor doesn't have full context. My father said, Dorothy Achebe has been our auditor for 2 years. She has full access to every account. Khalad said, Some of those vendor payments were for things that benefited the business. I said, Page 14 lists every vendor payment Hargrove and Lind flagged, with the corresponding job record or the absence of one. If any of those payments have a legitimate business purpose that isn't documented in the job records, this is the moment to identify them. Khalad looked at page 14. His hand, which had been resting on the armrest of his chair, went flat and still. He said, I was going to pay it back. My father said, How much? Khalad said, Most of it. My father said, The report says $67,420. The room was quiet. My mother turned to the last page of the report and read something there. Then she closed it. My father took off his reading glasses and held them in his hand. He looked at Khalad for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at me. He said, You knew before Sunday. I said, I suspected before Sunday. I knew as of yesterday afternoon. He said, Why didn't you come to us when you suspected? I said, Because I wanted to bring you a document, not a suspicion. You built this business on your word. I wasn't going to make an accusation against your son without being certain. My mother said quietly to my father, She protected us. My father looked at the report on his knee. Khalad said, This isn't. This is more complicated than. My father said, Stop. He said it without volume. He said it the way a man says a thing when he has reached the end of a long patience. Khalad stopped. What followed was not a single conversation but a series of them, over the next 3 weeks, that I was mostly not present for. My parents met with their attorney, a woman named Auditor Nwosu at a Raleigh firm called Nwosu and Associates, who specialized in small business disputes. They met with Dorothy Achebe. They met with Khalad, separately, multiple times. I know the outline of what was decided because my father called me on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the Friday meeting and told me, in the methodical way he communicated important things, what would happen. Khalad would repay the $67,420 in full, structured as a formal repayment agreement drafted by Auditor Nwosu, secured against his equity stake in the business. The repayment schedule was set at $1,800 per month over 40 months, with a balloon provision if he sold any personal assets above a threshold. He would step back from all financial account access immediately and permanently. His operational role, running field crews, would continue because the business needed him in that capacity and because my parents were not prepared to remove him from the business entirely, which was their right, and a decision I had not asked them to make differently. My father said, He will not be in the accounts again. I said, I know. He said, Auditor drafted a formal authorization structure. Only you have signatory access going forward. She'll send you the documents. I said, All right. He said, Celeste. He paused. The pause was the kind that contains a sentence he was working out how to say. What he did to you on Sunday? I said, Dad. He said, I didn't ask you. I should have asked you. I said, you have the report now. He said, I'm telling you I should have asked before the report. I said, yes, you should have. He said nothing for a moment. I said, I know why you didn't. I know what it costs to believe something like this about your son. I'm not asking you to explain it. He said, that's more generous than I deserve right now. I said, probably. But I'd like us to be able to have Sunday lunch again at some point, so I'm making an investment. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. The formal authorization documents from Auditor and Nwosu arrived by email the following Friday, a signatory access agreement, a revised operational authority structure for the business, and a formal record of the repayment agreement. I read them carefully, signed where indicated, and filed. The originals. I called Gerald Fosu at Triangle Financial Group to let him know about the authorization change and to schedule a transition meeting. He said, I saw the Hargrove and Lind report. Dorothy does good work. I said, she does. He said, this kind of thing is harder when it's family. I said, yes. He said, you handled it cleanly. I thanked him and moved on. The Sunday lunches resumed in February, about 6 weeks after the Friday meeting. My mother cooked the same food she always cooked. My father sat at the head of the table. Khalad was there, and his wife Temi, and their daughter, who was 4 and who spent most of the meal attempting to balance a spoon on the edge of her plate while the adults talked about other things. Khalad and I did not have a direct conversation about what had happened for another 3 months. When we did, it was brief. He called me on a weekday morning, said he needed to say something, and then said, I told them you were stealing because I thought if they believed it first, they'd be less likely to look at me. I need you to know that I know that was wrong. I said, I know why you did it. He said, that doesn't make it right. I said, no, it doesn't. He said, can we work together? I said, we already are. He said, I mean going forward. Is that? I said, Khalad, you run the field crews. I run the books. That's the division. It's working. Let's let it work. He said, okay. I said, the first repayment posted correctly last week. I confirmed it. There was a pause. Then, I know. I said, good. I'll let you know if anything's off. He said, it won't be. I said, I know. Adeyemi Home Services had its strongest revenue quarter on record in the spring following all of this, $387,000 in the first quarter, which was a 17% increase over the same period the prior year. I presented the numbers to my parents at the March family review meeting, the same format we'd been using since I came back from NC State. My mother put her hand over her mouth for a moment, the same gesture she'd made the year before. My father looked at the page, and then looked at me. He said, you've been taking care of this. I said, that's what you hired me to do. He said, I hired you because you're family. I said, I stayed because of the work. He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded once in the way he nodded when something was settled. My mother brought out the food. Dorothy Achebe called me in April. She said the forensic audit report had been submitted to a regional accounting ethics panel, a routine step when a CFE supervised report documents fraud, and that a panel member had asked her a question about the methodology I'd used to identify the initial discrepancies before engaging her firm. She asked if she could share my reconciliation document as part of the methodology response. I said yes. She said, the panel chair asked who prepared the original analysis. I told her you did. I said, that's fine. She said she'd like to speak with you. I said, about what? Dorothy said, she's teaching a forensic accounting seminar at NC State in the fall. She asked if you'd be interested in presenting a case study on the early identification methodology. I said nothing for a moment. Dorothy said, you don't have to decide now. I told her I'd pass the message along. I said, tell her yes. The seminar was in October. 43 graduate students, a 2-hour session, a case study I built from anonymized versions of the 3 vendor account discrepancies. The panel chair, A professor named Dr. Winifred Ogbu in the accounting department introduced me with a description of the forensic review process and what the early identification had allowed the auditors to establish. She described the methodology as a model for how internal discovery should interact with external forensic engagement. I presented for 90 minutes. 3 students asked follow-up questions afterward that were better than most of the questions I'd gotten in my professional career. I stayed an extra 40 minutes. On the drive home, I stopped at a gas station on Hillsborough Street and sat in the parking lot for a moment. I thought about the Sunday lunch. I thought about Claude's flat voice and the folder on the table, and my mother not looking at me. I thought about my father saying he always knew something was off said about me, from a reflex he probably hadn't examined before that moment, and probably had examined many times since. And I thought about the 43 students in that room who were going to go out into businesses and families and institutions carrying a framework for what to do when the numbers don't add up. Not panic, not accuse, not retreat into assumption, but document, verify, and wait for the evidence to do what evidence does when it's allowed to be complete. That felt like something. The repayment agreement has 7 months of payments recorded as of this telling. Each one is posted on the correct date. I confirm them the morning after and note them in the ledger. My father knows I do this. He has never asked me to stop. Claude runs a crew of 14 now. The business has grown, and the field operation has grown with it. He is, in the domain where his abilities are real, very good. The clients like him. The crews respond to him. These things were true before, and they are true now, and separating what someone is capable of from what they have done is, I have found, the only sustainable way to continue working alongside a person you are also related to. Sunday lunches are Sundays. My mother still does the invoicing. Habit dies slowly, though now it's in the actual accounting software, properly integrated, and I review it on Monday mornings. My father still comes to the office every day. His client relationships are still the warmest thing the business has. The framed photo of my parents in front of the original van is still on my desk. There is a thing that happens when you are the person in a family who is organized and patient and competent with documents. People assume that your composure means you are all right. They assume that if something were wrong, you would say so, because you are capable of saying so. They forget, or they never learned, that being capable of a thing and being believed when you do it are different conditions, and that the belief has to be earned separately, and that sometimes the only way to earn it is to let the record speak after you've walked out of the room. I did not walk out of that kitchen on Sunday to make a point. I walked out because there was nothing to say that the audit could not say better, and the audit needed 11 more days to finish saying it. The records were thorough. That was all I needed. What you know and what you can prove are not always the same thing. The patient work is building the gap between them until it disappears. In the months since that Sunday lunch, the report is filed, the repayment is current, the business had its best quarter on record, and I presented the methodology at NC State to 43 graduate students. My father told me I'd been taking care of things. I told him that was the job. The kitchen table, where my mother did invoicing for 20 years, is still there. I sat at it last Sunday. She brought coffee without being asked. If you have ever been the person in the room who knew the full picture while everyone else was working from someone else's version of it, if you have ever had to choose between defending yourself in real time and waiting for the evidence to arrive, I want to ask you, was there a moment when you decided the proof would speak louder than anything you could have said in that room? And were you right? Thank you for being here. Subscribe for a new story every week, and if this one found someone who needed it, send it to them.